Hey, boys and girls. Thank you to Anna and Ella, who both responded to those questions about the critical choices that Kensuke and Michael had made. Both of them pretty much said that what we learned from them is that when somebody wrongs us or makes us mad, we want to do the same to them by acting in a not so positive way or doing something that we think would upset them, which I think is pretty true, especially when we get mad at a friend or a family member. Our first instinct is to respond poorly, and that's what we saw them do. One critical choice that Ella mentioned that Kensuke made was that he decided to help Michael and go out and risk getting hurt and getting stung by a jellyfish and rescue him from the ocean, actually twice, right? Because he did when Michael fell off the boat and was drowning, and he also did when Michael was stung by the jellyfish and was drowning. So right when we left off yesterday, let's see, Kensuke had brought Michael into his cave to care for him because Michael couldn't even move or speak or do anything for quite a while after he was stung so much by that jellyfish. And Michael spent days just watching Kensuke. He said that he painted a lot, but he would always wash it away and he would never show him what it was, which he hated. And he also mentioned that there was a ton of pots and pans and shelves that were made and a table that was really low to the ground, and that he would dry herbs and flowers and bring them over to Michael to smell them. So let's see, right where we left off, or about where we left off, he talked about him wearing a kimono. Kensuke says the floor was entirely covered with mats made of woven rushes, like our sleeping mats. And everywhere, all around the cave, to head height and above, the walls were lined with bamboo. It was simple, but it was a home. There was no clutter. Everything had its place and its purpose. As I got better, Kensuke would go off and leave me on my own more and more, but thankfully, never for too long. He'd return later, very often singing with fish, perhaps fruit, coconut, or herbs, which he'd bring over to show me proudly. The orangutans would sometimes come with him, but only as far as the cave mouth. They'd peer in at me and at Stella, who always kept her distance from them. Only the young ones ever tried to venture in, and then Kensuke only had to clap at them and they'd soon go scooting off. During those days in the cave house, I so much wished we could talk. There were 1,000 mysteries, 1,000 things I wanted to know, but it would still hurt me to talk. And besides, I felt he was quite happy with our silence, that he preferred it somehow. He seemed a very private person and content to be that way. Then one day, after hours of kneeling hunched over one of his paintings, he came over and gave it to me. It was a picture of a tree in blossom. His smile said everything. "For you, Japan tree," he said. "I, Japanese person." After that, Kensuke showed me all the paintings he did, even the ones he later washed off. They were all in black and white wash of orangutans, gibbons, butterflies, dolphins, birds, and fruit. Only very occasionally did he keep one, storing it away carefully in one of his chests. He did keep several of the tree paintings, I noticed. Always a tree in blossom, a Japan tree, as he called it. And I could see he took particular joy in showing me these. It was clear he was allowing me to share something very dear to him. I felt honored by that. In the dying light of each day, he would sit beside me and watch over me, the last of the evening sun on his face. I felt as if he were healing me with his eyes. At night, I thought often of my mother and my father. I so much wanted to see them again, to let them know I was still alive. But strangely, I no longer missed them. In time, I found my voice again. The paralysis gradually lost its grip on me and my strength flowed back. Think about what that word paralysis means. That might be something that you want to Google. Paralylsis, so that you can better understand what he means when he says that. Now I could go out with Kensuke whenever he invited me, and he often did. To begin with, I would squat on the beach with Stella and watch him spearfishing in the shallows. So still he stood, and his strike was lightning fast. Then one day he made me my own spear. I was to fish with him. He taught me where the bigger fish were, where the octopuses hid under the rocks, how to stand still as a heron and wait, spear poised just above the water, my shadow falling behind me so that the fish were not frightened away. I tell you, spearing a fish for the first time was like scoring a winning goal for the mudlarks back home. Just about the best feeling in the world. Kensuke seemed to know every tree in the forest, where all the fruit grew, what was ripe and what was not, what was worth climbing for. He climbed impossible trees nimbly, footsure and fearless. Nothing in the forest alarmed him. Not the howling gibbons swinging above his head to drive him off their fruit. Not the bees that swarmed about him when he carried down their comb from a hollow high in a tree. He used the honey for sugaring and bottling fruit. And always, his family of orangutans came along, shadowing us through the forest, patrolling the tracks ahead, scampering along behind. All Kensuke had to do was sing, and they'd come. They seemed almost hypnotized by the sound of his voice. They were intrigued by me and Stella, but they were nervous, and we were nervous, and for the time being, we kept our distance from each other. One evening, quite unexpectedly, as I was watching Kensuke at his fishing, one of the young ones clambered onto my lap and began to examine my nose with his finger, and then he investigated my ear. He pulled it rather harder than I liked, but I didn't yelp. After that, the rest followed suit, using me as if I were a jungle gym. Even the older ones, the bigger ones, would reach out and touch me from time to time. But thankfully, they were always more reserved, more circumspect. But Stella still kept a certain distance from them, and they from her. In all this time, I suppose it must have been several months on the island by now, Kensuke said very little. The little English he did speak was clearly hard for him. When words were used between us, they proved to be of little help in our understanding of each other. So we resorted for the most part to smiles and nods, to signing and pointing. Sometimes we even drew pictures in the sand to explain ourselves. It was just about enough to get along, but there was so much I was burning to find out. How had he come to be here all alone on the island? How long had he been here? And how had he come by all those pots and pans and tools and the knife that he always wore in his belt? How come one of his wooden chests was stuffed with sheets? Where had they come from? Where had he come from? And why was he being so kind to me now, so considerate, when he had clearly resented me so much before? But whenever I ventured any such question, he would simply shake his head and turn away from me like a deaf man ashamed of his affliction. I was never quite sure whether he really did not understand or just did not want to understand. Either way, I could see it made him uncomfortable, so I probed no more. Questions, it seemed, were an intrusion. I resigned myself to waiting. Our life together was always busy, and regular as clockwork. Up at dawn and down the track a little way to bathe in the stream, where it tumbled cold and fresh out of the hillside into a great cauldron of smooth rocks. We would wash our sheets and clothes here, too. He'd made me my own kimono by now, slapping and pounding them on the rocks before hanging them out to dry on the branch of a nearby tree. Breakfast was a thick, pulpy fruit juice that seemed different every day, and bananas or coconut. I'm never tired of bananas, but very soon became sick of coconut. The mornings were spent either fishing in the shallows or fruit gathering in the forest. Sometimes after a storm, we scoured the beach for more of his painting shells. Only the biggest and flattest would do. Or for flotsam to join the stack of wood at the back of the cave. There were 2 stacks, one clearly for firewood, the other, I suppose, reserved for his woodwork. Then it was home to the cave house for a lunch of raw fish, always delicious, and usually bread fruit, always bland and difficult to swallow. A short nap after lunch for both of us, and then he would settle down at his table to paint. As I watched, I became so engrossed that the failing of light of evening always came too soon for me. We would cook a fish soup over the fire. Everything went in, heads and tails. Kensuke wasted nothing. A dozen different herbs, and there were always red bananas afterwards. All I could eat. I never went hungry. When supper was over, we would sit together at the mouth of the cave and watch the last of the sun drop into the sea. Then, without a word, he'd stand up. We would bow solemnly to each other, and he would unroll his sleeping mat and leave me to mine. To see Kensuke at his work was always a wonder to me. He was so intent, so concentrated in everything he did. But watching him paint was best of all. To begin with, he would only let me kneel beside him and watch. I could sense that in this, too, he liked his privacy, that he did not want to be disturbed. On the table in front of him, he put out 3 saucers. 1 saucer of octopus ink. For Kensuke, octopuses were not just for eating. 1 saucer of water, and another for mixing. He always held his brush very upright and very steady in his hand. Fingers down one side, thumb on the other. He would kneel bent over his work, his beard almost touching the shell he was painting. I think perhaps he was a little nearsighted. I would watch him for hours on end, marveling at the delicacy of his work, at the sureness of his touch. Their relationship has changed so much, even since we left school, in the past few chapters that we've read, the past few pages that we've read together. I want you to think about what reason you think that Kensuke has for changing the way that he treats and feels about Michael, and why you think that shift is happening. I also want you to think about how Michael's changed his thinking. Ever since Kensuke has rescued him from the jellyfish, which he was so angry, right? Remember that he swam out into the jellyfish because he was so mad at Kensuke. How has Michael's thinking changed since being rescued by Kensuke? And what do you think made him change that thinking? Comment below, and you'll get another shout out if you do.